At its absolute height, General Motors employed 80,000 people in a single American city. Not a region, not a state, one city, Flint, Michigan, the place where the company was born. Across dozens of factories, men and women built Buicks and Chevrolets and Cadillacs, engines and spark plugs and truck frames, their wages feeding a city of 190,000 souls. By the mid-1950s, General Motors had become the largest corporation on Earth. It controlled roughly half of all American car sales. When its executives spoke, governments listened. When Charlie Wilson, GM's president, was asked whether there was a conflict of interest in running the Pentagon, he replied that what was good for the country was good for General Motors, and vice versa. Then the decisions began. Roger Smith closed 11 Flint plants and eliminated 30,000 jobs, while announcing record executive bonuses. The company spent $90 billion automating factories with robots that famously painted each other instead of the cars. Leadership loaded the company with brands nobody needed. 48 separate models, 8 full divisions, a corporate structure so bloated that no one inside it could see the floor. By 2005, GM posted a loss of $10.6 billion. By 2008, it lost $30.9 billion more in a single year. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the largest industrial bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The filing listed $82 billion in assets and $173 billion in debt. On the floor of the Flint assembly plant on Van Slyke Road, a building erected in 1947 when Hal Newhouser was still pitching for the Tigers, the line went quiet. The clamps stopped closing. The frames stopped moving. The torque wrenches went still. Where 80,000 GM workers once punched in across Flint, fewer than 5,000 remained when the bankruptcy was filed. If this kind of story matters to you, stories about the men and women who actually built things and what happened when those things were taken from them, subscribe. We tell one of these every week. This is the story of William Crapo Durant, who built an empire from a $2,000 bank loan and a borrowed cart design, and of the men who came after him, who inherited that empire and spent 50 years dismantling it, decision by decision, restructuring by restructuring, until the assembly line on Van Slyke Road fell silent, and a president of the United States had to step in to decide if General Motors would survive at all. William Crapo Durant was born in Boston, Massachusetts, on December 8, 1861. His father abandoned the family when William was 7 years old. His mother, Rebecca, moved the boy to Flint, Michigan, to live with relatives, and the city that would become the cradle of the American automobile industry became home to a fatherless child with little formal schooling and enormous ambition. He dropped out of high school. He worked in his grandfather's lumberyard. He sold cigars, and he was so good at it that he outsold 3 other salespeople combined. By the time he was 24, people in Flint already understood that Billy Durant was not like other men. Friends said he could coax a bird right down out of a tree. Walter Chrysler, who would one day build his own rival empire, said of Durant that he could sell sand to Arabs and then come back and sell them sieves to sift it. In 1886, Durant was riding in a friend's horse-drawn cart when something about its suspension struck him. Smooth, balanced, better than anything else on Flint's broken roads. He tracked the manufacturer to a small factory in Coldwater, Michigan, and bought the production rights for $1,500. He didn't have $1,500, he borrowed it. He partnered with Josiah Dallas Dort, and together they launched the Flint Road Cart Company. By 1890, their company was producing 50,000 vehicles a year. By the turn of the century, the Durant Dort Carriage Company was the largest manufacturer of horse-drawn vehicles in the United States. He hated automobiles. He thought they were dangerous, noisy, and embarrassing contraptions that frightened horses and reasonable men alike. He refused to let his own daughter ride in one. But in 1904, a Flint businessman named James Whiting was trying to save a struggling car company called Buick, and he needed a salesman. He found Durant. Durant took a Buick out on Flint's roads alone for a month, testing it on dirt, on mud, on everything the Michigan landscape could offer. He came back convinced. Within 4 years, he had transformed Buick from a factory with debt and almost no output into the best-selling automobile in America. In 1908, Buick production surpassed Ford and Cadillac combined. That September, he took a night train to Lansing, Michigan. He knocked on doors in the dark. He proposed a holding company that would bind multiple brands under a single roof, the opposite of Ford's one-car strategy, which Durant had always considered a poverty of imagination. They said yes. On September 16, 1908, General Motors was incorporated. The founding capital was $2,000. Durant's central insight was not an engineering discovery, it was a retail revelation. The kind of idea so obvious it arrives disguised as common sense. He had spent 20 years in the carriage business, and he understood something Henry Ford did not. That different people wanted different things. A farmer needed a sturdy, cheap workhorse. A doctor needed something reliable and respectable. A banker needed something that would not embarrass him outside the club. Ford's solution was to build one car in one color for everyone. Durant's solution was to build many. In his first 2 years, General Motors assembled 30 companies, including 11 automobile manufacturers. Oldsmobile came on November 12, 1908. Cadillac followed. Oakland, which would become Pontiac. The Rapid Motor Vehicle Company, ancestor of GMC. Durant tried to buy Ford Motor Company in 1909 for $8 million, but the banks refused him the $2 million down payment. He moved on. He bought more. The model that saved General Motors from the crushing sameness of the Ford era was a pricing ladder so simple and effective, it is still the architecture of the automotive industry today. At the bottom sat Chevrolet, the people's car. Then Pontiac. Then Oldsmobile. Then Buick. At the top, Cadillac. You began at Chevrolet because it was what you could afford. You aspired toward Cadillac because that was what prosperity looked like. You traded upward through the brands as your fortunes improved, and at every stage, General Motors took the money. Alfred Sloan, who would become GM's greatest CEO, called it a car for every purse and purpose. By 1931, the year GM overtook Ford as the world's largest automaker, a position it would hold for the next 77 consecutive years, the pricing ladder was generating profits on a scale that redefined what an industrial corporation could be. In 1923, GM sold 800,000 cars and trucks. By 1929, those sales approached 2 million units annually. Profit that year, nearly $250 million. The model worked because it answered a question Ford had refused to ask. Not what is the cheapest car we can make, but what does the customer want to become? Durant never lived to see the full flowering of what he built. Ousted by bankers in 1910, returned in 1916, forced out again in 1920, he eventually ran a bowling alley in Flint and died in 1947. But the architecture remained. For decades it was unbeatable. Stand at the gate of the Flint assembly plant on Van Slyke Road and close your eyes. Even now, even after all of it, you can smell the place before you enter it. Machine oil and bare metal and the particular sharpness of freshly stamped steel. In the years of full production, the sound inside was total. The hydraulic clamp pressing down, the frame jolting forward, the air gun screaming across a bolt, and underneath all of it, the endless mechanical rhythm of the line. Relentless, indifferent, exactly 60 seconds between each station. The plant opened in 1947 on a tract of land in southwest Flint, replacing the older complex at the corner of Chevrolet Avenue and Kersley Street, a place the workers called Chevy in the Hole because it sat in a floodplain alongside the Flint River. The new plant was enormous. Over 3 million square feet of production floor, paint booths, body shop, and final assembly. In June 1953, the first 300 Chevrolet Corvettes were hand-built here by a small team, before the model moved to its permanent home. After 1970, the plant converted entirely to trucks. In 1975, the Flint assembly plant employed 7,500 workers. Bob Hooks worked the line at Flint Assembly as Joint Activity Coordinator and was a third-generation union man under UAW Local 598. His father Lester had worked the same plant, his grandfather before that. Ben Hamper, shop rat, fourth-generation GM worker, later a celebrated writer, started at the Flint Truck and Bus plant on Vanslyke Road in 1977, when his grandfather, his grandmother, multiple aunts and uncles, and his own father had all worked GM plants in Flint. Right from the outset, Hamper wrote, when the call went out for shop rats, my ancestors responded in almost Pavlovian compliance. The family tree practically listed right over on its side, with eager men and women grasping for that great automotive dream. He was laid off in 1988. At peak production, every 60 seconds, a pickup truck rolled off that line. The clamps closed, the frame moved, the torque gun fired. 60 seconds. Again. That is the motif of this story. Not the corporate announcements, not the bankruptcy filings, not the press conferences. The clamps closing, the frame moving, the torque gun firing. 60 seconds. Again. Remember it, because the silences between those sounds, when the clamps stopped, when the line went still, those silences are the real story. By the peak years of the 1970s, a General Motors assembly worker at Flint carried knowledge in his hands that no manual could fully capture. The step-by-step process of assembling a full-size pickup truck, the positioning of the cab onto the frame, the alignment of the suspension components, the torque specifications applied to 100 different fasteners across a dozen stations, required months of supervised training before a new hire was considered reliable. A skilled trades worker managing the welding robots or the paint booth systems might spend years accumulating the craft, and the quality threshold was unforgiving. At GM's peak production years, final inspection rejected or reworked significant percentages of vehicles before they ever reached a dealer. At its apex in the early 1970s, General Motors held roughly 46% of the United States automobile market. In 1978, the company employed 77,000 people in the Flint metropolitan area alone, in manufacturing plants and office centers and supplier facilities that radiated out from the city's old industrial core. The company had operations on 6 continents. It held the top position in global vehicle sales for 77 consecutive years, from 1931 until the moment in 2008 when Toyota overtook it. In 1978, GM's revenue was measured in the tens of billions. The Flint assembly complex produced trucks and SUVs for a market that had never been larger or more profitable. A Flint line worker earned wages that bought a house on the north side, put children through Catholic school, and left enough over for a fishing boat. The United States, people said, ran on GM money. And in 1979, while the Flint line ran 3 shifts and production records were being set and broken, General Motors began a program that would ultimately cost $90 billion. A sweeping modernization of its manufacturing base, intended to automate the factories and reduce dependence on human labor. The robots that GM installed famously painted each other instead of the cars. Doors were welded shut. The program consumed a fortune and delivered chaos. The line kept moving. but the decision had been made. The forces pressing on General Motors from outside were real, and anyone who dismisses them is not paying attention. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent gasoline prices into crisis and exposed GM's dependence on large, fuel-hungry vehicles. By the late 1970s, Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, were delivering smaller, more fuel-efficient cars with quality standards that American consumers had never experienced from Detroit. The yen-dollar exchange rate gave Japanese manufacturers an effective price advantage that could not easily be overcome. Between 2007 and 2008, the global financial crisis collapsed US vehicle sales from more than 17 million units annually to fewer than 10 million, the most severe contraction since the Great Depression. These were genuine headwinds. No honest account amidst them. But the industry was not doomed, and the evidence is in plain sight. Ford Motor Company faced identical external conditions. The same oil shocks, the same Japanese competition, the same financial crisis, the same frozen credit markets. Ford did not file for bankruptcy. Ford did not require a government bailout. Ford mortgaged its assets, restructured its operations, and survived, without a single dollar of taxpayer emergency support. Toyota, operating plants on American soil, absorbed the same market crash. Honda did the same. Neither collapsed. The question is not whether the market turned against GM. It did. The question is why GM could not survive a market shift that its competitors navigated. The answer is not in Tokyo or Frankfurt or Washington. It is in Detroit and in Flint. Between 1980 and 2008, General Motors accumulated more than $100 billion in combined losses. It maintained 8 brands, 96 models in some peak years, and a legacy cost structure, healthcare, pensions, dealer agreements, that added approximately $2,000 to the cost of every vehicle it produced before a single bolt was tightened. Its labor costs were structurally higher than those of any competitor. But the same UAW that negotiated those costs also worked in Ford plants. Ford survived. Toyota, with far lower legacy costs, still had to manage the same market crash. The external pressures set the stage. They did not write the ending. The ending was written inside GM, in boardrooms, in strategy meetings, by named individuals making specific choices. Those choices are what comes next. January 1st, 1981. Roger Bonham Smith became chairman and chief executive officer of General Motors Corporation. He had started at GM in 1949 as an accounting clerk. He rose through finance. He was not an engineer. He was not a product man. He was a numbers man who had decided correctly that GM's cost structure was broken, and who then attempted to fix it with a strategy that would consume $90 billion over a decade and leave the company weaker than when he started. Smith's central conviction was that automation would save GM. He saw Japanese factories and concluded that robots were the answer. Between 1981 and 1990, GM spent upwards of $90 billion on technology, a sum so large it could have purchased every Japanese automaker on the planet at the prices of that era. The robots arrived. They malfunctioned spectacularly. Paint systems sprayed each other. Welding machines closed doors permanently. One automated plant in Hamtramck, described by workers as science fiction gone wrong, was so unreliable that production targets were abandoned within months of opening. But the robots were not the full cost. In 1985, while laying off thousands of Flint workers and announcing plant closures across the city, Smith's GM paid him a personal compensation package that workers and union officials called obscene. And in 1984, Smith reorganized GM's divisional structure, dismantling the semi-autonomous brand architecture that Alfred Sloan had built across 4 decades, the very structure that had made GM the world's largest automaker. The reorganization was intended to reduce redundancy. It produced instead a corporation so internally confused that Chevrolets began sharing platforms with Cadillacs in ways that undermined both. Then came the plant closures. Smith announced the shuttering of 11 facilities, most of them in Flint, 30,000 jobs were eliminated. GM was reporting record profits at the time. In Flint, a woman interviewed by filmmaker Michael Moore described killing rabbits to feed her children after the plant closed. Smith declined every invitation to visit the city his decisions had gutted. The road not taken. Investment in the quality programs that Japanese manufacturers had built their reputations on. GM knew, its own internal reports confirmed, that quality was the core problem. The robots were the answer to a question no customer had asked. "We need to build an environment," Ross Perot, then GM's largest shareholder, told Smith publicly, "where the first guy who sees the snake kills it." Smith bought out Perot's shares for $750 million to end the argument. After Roger Smith retired in 1990, General Motors began the long performance of musical chairs that would define its next 2 decades. Robert Stempel inherited the company. He lasted 2 years before the board, reorganized by outside directors, forced him out in November 1992. John F. Smith Jr. took over, held on through 2000, and began the long market share erosion that would prove irreversible. Smith's tenure saw the discontinuation of Oldsmobile, a brand founded in 1897 that became the first American nameplate to turn 100, and then went extinct. Rick Wagoner became president in 2000 and chairman in 2003. Under Wagoner's leadership, General Motors suffered more than $85 billion in cumulative losses. Each year brought new restructuring announcements. Each restructuring brought new charges, new layoffs, new plant closures, new promises that the corner had been turned. In 2005, GM lost $10.6 billion. In 2008, it lost $30.9 billion, or 53.32 per share, in a single year. Wagoner's compensation in his final years as CEO was reported at approximately $14.9 million annually. The company that William Durant incorporated with $2,000 was paying its chief executive $14.9 million a year, while losing $30 billion in 12 months. In November 2008, Wagoner flew to Washington, D.C. aboard a corporate jet to beg Congress for emergency loans. The optics were catastrophic. Congress humiliated the executives publicly. GM returned empty-handed. The company received $13.4 billion from the Bush administration's TARP funds in December 2008 as emergency bridge financing. Deloitte & Touche, GM's auditors, issued a going concern qualification in March 2009, the formal language that accountants use when they believe a company may not survive. Each executive had contradicted the one before him. Each restructuring had promised savings that never materialized. Each wave of automation had delivered costs instead of efficiencies. The clamps stopped closing. The frames stopped moving. The torque gun went silent. The line that had run 3 shifts in 1978, that had employed 7,500 workers in 1975, that had built the first Corvettes by hand in 1953, stood idle in plants across Flint while lawyers drafted bankruptcy papers in Manhattan. We are just past halfway. If you are finding this valuable, the history, the research, the detail, a like takes 2 seconds, and it means we can keep making these. Now back to the story. The movement of General Motors production away from American workers did not happen in a single announcement. It happened in increments. A parts contract transferred here, a new facility opened there. Each individual step described by management as a competitive necessity, the cumulative effect of which was the systematic hollowing of the industrial base that had made Flint what it was. Roger Smith's stated rationale for the Flint plant closures in the 1980s was direct. GM could pay workers in Mexico approximately 70 cents an hour. American line workers at the Flint assembly plant, represented by UAW Local 598, earned wages and benefits that by the 1980s carried a total effective labor cost far exceeding their Mexican counterparts. The arithmetic was not complicated. The consequences were not limited to corporate spreadsheets. When the Buick City complex, the massive Flint manufacturing center that had, at its peak in the mid-1980s, employed 28,000 workers, finally closed on June 29, 1999, only 1,200 workers remained on its floor. The 235-acre facility that GM had proudly redesigned in 1983, combining multiple factories into a state-of-the-art complex, inspired by Toyota's integrated production model, went dark after 16 years. 28,000 workers reduced to 1,200. A complex built as a statement of confidence, dismantled as a concession to cost. GM employment in the Flint metropolitan area fell from 77,000 in 1978 to 33,000 in 1999. By 2009, the year of the bankruptcy filing, fewer than 5,000 workers held GM jobs in a city where GM had once employed almost 1 in every 2 adults. The quality decline accompanied the transfer. Workers and union representatives documented the deterioration in components sourced from lower-cost facilities, fit and finish problems, tolerance variations, the subtle degradations that show up in warranty claims and customer satisfaction surveys. Toyota, building cars in American plants with American workers, was posting quality scores that GM executives received in internal reports and discussed in meetings that produced no lasting corrective action. By the mid-2000s, GM's share of the American car market had fallen below 26%. In 1962, it had exceeded 50%. Somewhere in a Flint lot, a man who'd worked the line for 22 years turned in his badge and drove home in a Chevrolet, passing a factory that was already being stripped for scrap. June 1, 2009. A Monday morning, 8 o'clock in the Eastern Time Zone. The lawyers arrived at the federal bankruptcy court in the Southern District of New York and filed the papers. General Motors Corporation, founded September 16, 1908, in Flint, Michigan, the largest industrial corporation on Earth for much of the 20th century, employer of hundreds of thousands of Americans, builder of the cars and trucks that defined the post-war American dream, filed for Chapter 11 protection. The filing listed $82.29 billion in assets against $172.81 billion in debt. It was, at that moment, the 4th largest bankruptcy in American history and the largest ever filed by an industrial company. 3 weeks earlier, on March 29th, President Barack Obama had summoned Rick Wagoner to Washington and informed him that the administration's automotive task force, led by investment banker Steve Ratner, had concluded that GM's management team could not be trusted to execute the restructuring the company needed. Wagoner had run GM for 8 years. He had overseen more than $85 billion in losses. He had burned through $21 billion in cash in 2008 alone, then asked the government for more. Ratner wrote later that he was stunned by the suggestion that asking for a CEO's resignation was somehow inappropriate. Wagoner issued a statement saying he had been asked to step aside, and so he had. His severance arrangement was reported to include $8.2 million in pension benefits. On the floor of the Flint assembly plant on Van Slyke Road, workers arrived for their shift and heard the news from the radio in the break room. The plant had already survived plant closures, strikes, and recessions. The workers had seen the workforce around them shrink from 7,500 in 1975 to fewer than 1,500 by the time of the bankruptcy. Men whose grandfathers had marched out of the Fisher Body plant singing solidarity songs in February 1937 now stood in a break room listening to a news anchor explain that the company would be split in 2. That a new GM would take the brands and the machinery and the good contracts, and a shell entity called Motors Liquidation Company would be left to settle the debts. Shareholders were essentially wiped out. Their GM shares, which had traded at $40 in 2004, closed at 75 cents. The old GM was gone, and nobody came to Flint to explain it in person. The congressional hearing of November 18, 2008, is the moment the American public fully understood what had happened to General Motors. Rick Wagoner, along with Chrysler's Robert Nardelli and Ford's Alan Mulally, appeared before the Senate Banking Committee to request an emergency government loan of $25 billion. All three executives had flown to Washington on private corporate jets, a detail that Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut raised immediately, and which became the defining image of the hearings. "Couldn't you all have downgraded to first class, or jet-pooled or something?" asked Representative Brad Sherman of California. Wagoner estimated that if the American auto industry collapsed, 3 million jobs would be at risk. "This is all about a lot more than just Detroit," he said. "It's about saving the US economy from a catastrophic collapse." The committee sent them home without a deal. 3 months later, after the Bush administration had extended $13.4 billion in emergency bridge loans, President Obama's Auto Task Force concluded in March 2009 that GM's restructuring plans, submitted February 17th, did not establish a credible path to viability. The task force's formal language was measured, bureaucratic, and devastating. In their current form, they are not sufficient to justify a substantial new investment of taxpayer resources. Steve Ratner, the task force leader, wrote in a later account that Wagoner had set a tone of friendly arrogance that permeated the entire organization. The GM leadership, Ratner observed, seemed to believe that virtually all of their problems could be laid at the feet of some combination of the financial crisis, oil prices, the yen-dollar exchange rate, and the UAW. The United States Treasury ultimately invested $49.5 billion in General Motors through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. When the government sold its shares in December 2013, it recovered $39 billion. A loss to American taxpayers of $10.3 billion. A study by the Center for Automotive Research estimated that the bankruptcy intervention saved 1.2 million jobs and preserved $34.9 billion in tax revenue. Senator Carl Levin of Michigan, watching the bankruptcy filing on June 1, 2009, said, "There is still plenty of pain to go around, but I'm confident this is far better than the alternative. It's a new beginning. It's a rebirth." In Flint, where 1 in 3 residents lived below the poverty line, no one was using the word rebirth. On July 10, 2009, 40 days after the bankruptcy filing, the new General Motors completed its purchase of the profitable assets of the old company. The operation moved with a speed that surprised most observers. Under Section 363 of the Bankruptcy Code, valuable brands, plants, contracts, and intellectual property were transferred to a new entity backed by the United States Treasury, which took a 60% ownership stake. Canada, which had contributed more than $9 billion in loans, took an 11% stake. The UAW Retiree Healthcare Trust received approximately 17%. What remained in the shell, the entity renamed Motors Liquidation Company, were the liabilities, the pension obligations, the environmental remediation costs for decades of industrial pollution, and the legal claims of creditors who would receive, in many cases, cents on the dollar. Pontiac was gone. Oldsmobile, which had died in 2004, was gone. Saturn, which had never made a profit, was gone. Hummer was discontinued. Saab was sold to a Dutch company, went bankrupt 2 years later, and eventually found its way to Chinese ownership. The 4 surviving brands, Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, and Cadillac, would carry the new company. GM invested $2.8 billion in the Flint assembly complex between 2009 and the mid-2010s, a new body shop, paint shop upgrades. The plant that survived the bankruptcy continued building heavy-duty Silverado and Sierra trucks, the most profitable vehicles in GM's lineup, the products whose margins were funding the entire restructuring. In 2015, as Flint's water crisis was exploding into national headlines, GM announced an $877 million investment in the Flint assembly body shop. The plant employed approximately 3,164 workers at that point, building trucks on the same Van Slyke road site where 7,500 workers had once punched in for 3 shifts. The company's current marketing language celebrates innovation, craftsmanship, and American manufacturing heritage. It does not mention the $10.3 billion loss to the American taxpayer. It does not mention Buick City, or the 28,000 workers who built cars there, or the 235-acre complex that was demolished between 2001 and 2003. The rubble hauled away and the land left vacant. The clamps that closed and the torque guns that fired and the frames that moved, every 60 seconds, again and again, in a plant that has been gone for 20 years, in a city that never recovered. The men and women who had built General Motors trucks did not disappear when the line went quiet. They scattered into retraining programs that did not match their skills, into part-time service jobs that paid a fraction of their assembly line wages, into early retirements that were accepted under duress, into the long arithmetic of a pension that felt solid until the bankruptcy filings arrived in the mail. Gladys Williamson, a Buick retiree who had worked the Flint complex for decades, found after the closures that her Flint house had become nearly worthless. The neighborhood that GM wages had built, the split levels and ranch houses on the north side, the Catholic schools and the union halls and the small businesses that lived off assembly line paychecks, had begun the long collapse that would eventually make Flint synonymous not with automobile manufacturing, but with poisoned water and structural poverty. GM was the center of life for Flint, said Gladys McClinton, a GM metal fabricating worker who retired in 2009 after decades on the floor. It's a company town, a one-horse town, and many people came up here from the South, including my parents, and particularly African Americans, to work in the factories for a decent job and a decent life. The retraining question was blunt and largely unanswered. An assembly line worker with 20 years of torque gun and line feeding expertise did not easily become a software technician or a medical records administrator. The knowledge was in the hands and in the reflexes, knowledge that no retraining seminar could repurpose in 6 months. The displaced workers who found new employment in similar manufacturing roles fared tolerably. Those who crossed into different industries, different occupations, different skill domains, as research on displaced workers consistently documents, experienced earnings losses that persisted for years, sometimes for the rest of their working lives. GM employment in Flint fell from 80,000 in 1978 to approximately 5,000 at the time of the bankruptcy. More than a third of Flint's remaining population of 110,000 lived in poverty. 18% had incomes below 50% of the federal poverty line. The Northside Church, where one writer had been baptized, St. Agnes, 80 years old, closed in 2009. These are the stories that rarely make headlines, the people behind the brand names. If you think they deserve to be remembered, subscribe and share this with someone who would care about it. 2 sections left. There was a plan. There was always a plan. The question, in hindsight, is whether anyone with the authority to act on it was willing to do so while the doing was still possible. Throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s, voices inside and outside General Motors argued for a fundamental reorientation, not toward further automation and brand proliferation, but toward the quality-first manufacturing philosophy that had made Toyota and Honda dominant. GM's own internal quality reports, leaked or referenced in various accounts, showed management was fully aware that its vehicles were losing the quality race. The data was there. The conclusion was available. What was proposed? Consolidation to 4 core brands, reduction of the model lineup, Investment in quality systems. Elimination of the legacy cost structure through proactive negotiation rather than crisis-driven concession. Several restructuring advisors brought variations of this proposal to GM's board at different points between 2000 and 2007. None was adopted in full before the financial crisis removed the option. Ross Perot, when he was GM's largest shareholder in 1985 and 1986, made many of these arguments publicly and loudly. GM's response was to buy back his shares for $750 million, a transaction that became known in automotive circles as greenmail, to end the argument. Whether Perot's prescriptions would have saved GM is unknowable. What is known is that the company paid $750 million to stop hearing them. What survived is real, and it matters, even in its smallness. Flint Assembly on Van Slyke Road is still there. UAW Local 598 represents approximately 5,000 workers building heavy-duty Silverado and Sierra trucks, GM's most profitable products, the vehicles whose margins funded the post-bankruptcy recovery. In early 2026, the plant temporarily idled for renovations as GM invested nearly $800 million to prepare the facility for the next generation of heavy-duty gas-powered trucks. 5,000 workers out of 80,000 who once punched in across Flint. One plant where dozens operated. Trucks where there were once Buicks and Chevelles and Corvettes and vans and engines and spark plugs and stamped steel in every direction. The surviving plant is not a restoration. It is a remnant. And the people working it know the difference, even if the press releases do not acknowledge it. William Crapo Durant died on March 18, 1947, the same year the Flint Assembly Plant on Van Slyke Road opened its doors. He died partially paralyzed from a stroke suffered 5 years earlier in a modest apartment in New York City, his fortune long gone, his second automotive company dissolved, his bankruptcy declared in 1936. He had spent his last working years managing a bowling alley in Flint. He was buried in a mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The city he had made into the automotive capital of the world did not name a major street after him. There is no Durant Boulevard in Flint. The original factory where General Motors was born, the building on West Kearsley Street known as Factory 1, is now available for conference and event rentals. The site of Buick City, the massive complex that employed 28,000 workers at its peak and was demolished between 2001 and 2003, is largely vacant land. The rubble went. The workers went. The population of Flint fell from 190,000 at its manufacturing peak to approximately 80,000 today. The poverty rate, which stood above 1/3 even before the bankruptcy, has not meaningfully recovered. The Flint Assembly Plant on Van Slyke Road still stands. Go there now and you will find heavy-duty trucks being assembled by approximately 5,000 UAW workers under Local 598, building Silverados and Sierras on the same ground where 7,500 workers punched in for 3 shifts in 1975. The new body shop, completed with that $877 million investment, is modern and efficient and almost entirely automated. The clamps close, the frames move, the torque guns fire. But there are not 7,500 workers watching them. There are not 80,000 workers spread across the city's plants. There is no Buick City. There is no Fisher Body. There is no AC spark plug. There is no Flint Engine South running at full capacity. There is one plant, building trucks, on a road named for the family that donated the land, Van Slyke, in a city that gave General Motors everything it had and received, in return, a century of wages followed by a generation of abandonment. The clamps still close, the frames still move, the torque guns still fire. Every 60 seconds, somewhere in Flint, in a building surrounded by the silence of everything that used to stand beside it. If this story meant something to you, if you think the people who built things deserve to be remembered, subscribe. Every week, we tell one more of these. The stories are not running out, the factories are.